Hello, I'm Anne Burns, and I'm speaking to you from Macquarie University, Sydney, on a beautiful summer day in Australia. I'm really pleased to have been invited to do this keynote talk, and the focus of the talk today is going to be action research. All over the world now, there are teachers who have become interested in this form of research, but I often get asked the question, well, what is it and how do we do it? So what I'm going to talk about is some basic points about action research. The kind of thing that I'll cover is, well, what does action research mean? How do we do it? How do we identify a focus or a topic for the research? How do we establish the scope of the research and develop some research questions? What about collecting data? And then some thoughts at the end about data analysis. So let me start off by asking you a couple of questions. Have you heard about the term action research? Well, if so, what does the term mean to you? Do you already know something about this topic? And have you tried it out? If you've tried it out, have you done it with yourself, just on your own, or have you involved others in doing the research with you? Well, let's go back to the question, well, what is action research? I've often looked at a very useful definition, which was given some time ago now by Carr and Kemmis. And what these two authors said in 1986 was this: action research is simply a form of self-reflective inquiry undertaken by participants in social situations in order to improve the rationality and justice of their own practices, their understanding of these practices, and the situations in which the practices are carried out. You may have come across that definition sometime too. I've also had quite a few comments from teachers about what they think about action research, because I've been very lucky to conduct action research with teachers from many different parts of the world. Usually they say that they find it a very engaging way of doing professional development, but also learning more about research. For example, a teacher from Australia once said to me, well, action research encourages teachers to reach their own solutions and conclusions, and this is far more attractive than being presented with ideals which can't be attained. Another teacher that I worked with in Indonesia said, I will continue doing action research. Why did he say this? He'd been involved for a little while with a project with other teachers where he'd done collaborative work. Well, what he said was, I've no doubt about the advantages of an action research approach for my teaching, although it's also not easy to conduct it consistently. So perhaps you can see from the quote that I've just read out, and also some of the comments from these teachers, that there are some rather central concepts in action research. And the ones that have been extremely important are that action research has a kind of a social edge to it, a social concept. Some of the central concepts are these. First of all, they empower the participants in a social situation to find out more and understand more about their own practices. Some people want to undertake action research because it helps them to move towards a sort of a better world for the participants that they're working with and for themselves. They're self-consciously criticizing what exists through awareness of the givens in the situation and assumptions that shape the social situation. And also, they want to enhance awareness of their own subjective, intersubjective, and normative frames of reference, working to confront inequities in the system or working to transform the social system. So there is a critical and social justice edge to action research, as well as undertaking the more technical side of doing the research. So if we want to start doing action research, what do we actually do? Well, the central idea of action research is that it's done in a cyclical or spiral kind of way. And Carr and Kemmis and McTaggart and other people who have worked on models of action research say that there are 4 points in doing action research. The first one is to develop a plan of some sort. So this involves developing a plan of some critically informed action, which is designed to improve what you see already happening in your own situation. Usually for teachers, this is the classroom or the school. And then the next part is to act to implement the plan. So we develop some kind of plan of action to put into practice the changes or the strategies that we want to try out. Then the next part of the plan is to observe, and this means observing the effects of the action that we've decided to put into place in the particular context where it occurs, and to see what happens. And the final part of the cycle is to reflect on all of the things that have happened during this trialing of the different strategies. We reflect to see the effects of what has happened in the classroom, and we use our reflections as a basis for further planning. And this might involve some further critically informed action through a succession of stages where we go back into this cycle of plan, act, observe and reflect. So in fact, in action research, you may find yourself going through several cycles involving these kinds of processes. Now, I've suggested this cycle or this spiral in a rather neat and tidy kind of way, but in fact it can often end up being a lot more messy than that, where our reflections become part of our plans, our actions involve observation in a systematic kind of way, and the plans that we make for further action often involve observation, further reflection, and so on. So to sum up then, we can say that the key features of action research is a focus on a particular social situation, usually the classroom in the case of teachers. Sometimes there's collaboration and dialogue with others, and this is something I would really advise if you're contemplating doing action research, because it's immensely useful to have other people available with whom you can talk through your plans, try out your actions, observe, get them to observe or help each other observe what's going on in the classroom, and then work through some reflective ideas about what's actually occurred. The other point that I need to make about this cycle is that action research is different from just normal reflection or thinking intuitively about what we do in our classroom, because it involves systematic observation. And what I mean by this is the collection of some data, and this is where the research part of it comes in. By systematically collecting observations and ideas about what's going on in the classroom, we then have a firm basis on which to reflect further and to put some changes into place. So a very important part of action research is that we undertake data collection and don't rely just on our own assumptions or intuitions about what we feel is happening in the classroom and with the students around us. There are some other things that action research really doesn't set out to do, and this is why and how it's different from other forms of research that you may have heard of. First of all, we're not generally setting out to prove or disprove a hypothesis, at least not in the sense of experimental or scientific research. We may have hunches or hypotheses ourselves about things that work in the classroom, but the kind of research that we're likely to do is going to be much more qualitative, reflective, and does not really rely on experimental and scientific methods. We're not generally trying to establish control and experimental groups, although you may want to make some comparisons between the way in which different groups respond to different kinds of strategies that or activities that you put into place in the classroom. And we're generally not going to rely on the kind of research where you do pre and post testing. Although, again, you may want to do a rather simpler version of this by looking at people's test results before you've tried something out in the classroom, and what happens after you've tried out the activity in the classroom to see whether some improvements have been made. We're generally not going to be using inferential and statistical analyses, but more relying on possibly descriptive statistics if we want to describe things in quantitative terms. And we can't produce generalizable findings from action research because, as I've already described, it's something which is much more localized in our own social situation, usually one classroom or possibly a few classrooms in the school. And so it's not something, the findings that we get from action research are not capable of being generalized right across other situations. All we can really say is that they are examples of the kind of thing that can happen in a classroom where certain conditions are in operation. So what I'd say about action research then is that it's exploratory kind of research. And it's not research which we may think about in the traditional sense of very scientific experiments being conducted in laboratories. It's much more exploratory and interpretive, an interpretive way of doing research. So if we want to do action research, the first thing that we will have to do is to find a focus for action research. Now, you may have had for some time some questions that have been puzzling you or bothering you, or things that you've not been quite satisfied with in the classroom. And these may well be the basis of the research focus that you will want to take up. But I've got a few other practical ideas for how we can get some ideas for doing action research if you're not quite sure yet what you want to focus on. These are some things that other teachers have either told me about or that I've used by talking to other teachers. So here we go. Well, one of the things that you can do is to keep a diary for a specified period of time and list some things that have puzzled or intrigued you. Other people find it very useful to make a mind map and to connect up ideas that may have been burning away at the back of your mind for a while. It's sometimes very helpful to read an article, one that you like, or to read it again if it's a favorite, and to develop some questions from it that may be useful for you in your own classroom and in your own teaching. Or you may want to do some finishing statements. Now, what I mean by finishing statements is starting off a sentence that says something like, well, I don't know enough about, and you might want to finish the sentence by saying, what my students think about group work, or some other question that's been puzzling you for some time. The other way to get yourself started in finding a focus is to observe a situation in your workplace much more carefully than you would normally observe it. For example, there may have been some students who seem reluctant to participate in a particular kind of activity. When you do this activity again, just start observing them extremely carefully to see whether there are factors or issues that you may have not noticed before that may get you started on a way of investigating this problem a little bit further. Other colleagues may also be great sources of topics for your action research. So you may want to survey your friends or colleagues on the hot teaching issues that they have been wondering about or working on for a time in their own classrooms. And there may be recent journals or teachers' newsletters that you have in your teaching centre. Go back through them and see whether there are key topics that keep coming up time and time again, and these too may present ideas for your own research. You may or may not have clear questions in mind when you start on action research. Don't worry about that, because sometimes in action research we need to just observe our classrooms a bit more carefully or put new activities into practice and find out what happens as a result. But if and when you do get to the point of developing some very clear focus questions for the research, then just think about the following points. Try to make your questions as focused as possible. Don't attempt to do too much all in the same research topic or research project. So the questions you have should be as clear as you can make them, unambiguous and understandable by other people. You may want to try them out on others to see whether they can understand what it is you're focusing on. You should also try and make them very specific. Are they questions that you can actually answer? Can you get data to answer the particular questions that you've set up? Are they relevant? Are they worthwhile for the particular context that you're working in? there's not much point in trying to select a focus which you can't do something about. For example, the Ministry of Education policy in your country is not something that you're going to be able to readily change. But looking at issues within the kind of constraints that you have to work with within your own classroom or your own school may be a worthwhile topic to focus on. And the questions, if you have more than one of them, should be coherent. They should be interconnected and form a coherent whole and be related to each other. Another thing you can do to look at the scope of the study is to ask yourself some of these questions. First of all, are you interested in looking at individuals, perhaps a particular student in your classroom whose behavior or whose attitude or whose results have puzzled you for some time? Or do you want to look at a whole group, a whole class, a particular group in the classroom, or pairs of students? What resources will you need to have? Time, of course, is always a huge one for action research because as busy teachers, there is never really much time to spare to do research. There are not too many ways to cut down the time involved in action research, but certainly the teachers that I've worked with have felt that it has been worth the time expended on doing the additional work of action research. Do you need particular materials or resources or even funding to be able to do the research? And if so, who is going to provide these and help you to achieve these kinds of resources? Do you need to include anybody else, or at least tell them about your research? Do you need to approach your managers or colleagues? Do you need to talk to the students or even the parents of the students before you start doing the research? And are there ethical issues that you need to consider, like gaining permission from the participants, allowing them to withdraw from the research if they're not happy to continue, and so on? And in some schools, and particularly universities across the world, there are guidelines for how ethical points need to be considered, and so it's very useful to find out whether these are things that you need to look at in your own research context. Let's have a look next at what you can use for data collection and the way that you can collect information about the topic that you're interested in. Well, in the past I've talked in terms of two different kinds of sources or categories for collecting data. The first one is what we might call observational data. In other words, we're trying to find out what people do in a particular situation, their actions, their behaviors, and so on. And the other form of data collection is what I've called non-observational data. In other words, trying to get under the surface of what you can actually see to find out more about what people think. Well, let's think about the observational side first. Observation involves, of course, watching a social situation, and depending on what you choose to observe, this might be our classroom, it might be something else in the school situation, it might be a collaborative observation with two teachers helping each other and one observing the other and giving feedback. But usually the kind of things that we use to collect information in an observational situation are these. Often we want to make notes, notes about what's actually going on, and these can be factual accounts of the events that are going on as you observe them. You can also make more reflective notes, of course, and a lot of teachers have done this through a reflective journal or a diary where they've written down the most important things that may have happened during the lesson, and then their reflections or their observations or their evaluations about what those behaviours might mean. The other very useful way of collecting observational data is to record it, and luckily these days we have great technology available where we can use audio, video, MP3 recorders and so on to actually find out in exact detail what was said or what was done during the observational phase. And this is a great way of going back and looking at the things that we may not notice on a day-to-day basis in the classroom because we're so used to them and we take them so much for granted. So recording is really a very useful thing to do if you want to observe something carefully. Having recorded, of course, we often want to make transcripts, which is documenting the interactions, writing out exactly what happened in the verbal interaction or spoken interaction that went on during the activity. A word of warning, doing transcripts takes a very, very long time. So think carefully about how you want to do this. Do you need to transcribe the whole of the activity that you've watched, or can you just select from it and take parts of it to show what's going on in terms of the research question that you're interested in? Snapshots can be very useful too, and digital cameras, photographs, or even instant cameras, which students can use on a regular basis, can be extremely useful in capturing things like where people position themselves in the classroom, the kind of setup of the classroom that may not have been noticeable to you, and so on. And also, some teachers that I've worked with have constructed maps or diagrams of the classroom to show where students sit, how they position themselves, who works with whom, and the kind of how this may affect the interactions that have gone on in the classroom. We can also collect documents that are being used, course books, textbooks, students' writing, and so on, which accompany the various activities that have gone on in this observational situation. And all of these pieces of information can combine together to give you a very rich picture of what's actually happening in terms of the particular focus that you may want to take in your research. Well, having talked about observational data and a few of the ways in which you can collect that data, let's look now at some of the non-observational ways. I've already mentioned journals and diaries, and these can be very useful for retrospectively recording your ideas and your thoughts. They can be a way of debriefing from the events that you've been observing or the things that you're interested in, and writing at more length and with greater ability to think through writing the things that may not have been so obvious to you at the time. Another way of doing this is to jot down notes quickly, just in a random kind of way. They're memory aids which you can go back to at the time when you want to think over what was happening in the research situation. Lots of teachers use surveys and questionnaires in the classroom, and these are very, very useful as activities. So some of this data collection can actually double up as classroom activities. You may want to ask closed questions which have yes/no type answers and which are going to give you numerical information. Alternatively, you may want to have ranked questions, that is, where you ask people to choose between a number of different alternatives. What do you think of group work? Good, quite good, bad, poor, terrible, and so on. And these are sometimes the kinds of questions that are put into ranked surveys. Or you may want open questions where people simply respond through giving their opinions in a rather unstructured kind of way. The other thing that can be very useful is to undertake interviews, and these are everyday conversations which can be done, again, in different kinds of ways. They can be highly structured, where you ask the same questions over and over again to all the people that you interview, and this ensures great consistency amongst the types of answers that you're going to get. Or you may want a more semi-structured or unstructured kind of interview. In the semi-structured interview, you usually have a set of, or a broad set of questions that you might want to ask, but you allow for some diversion into thoughts or issues or ideas, concepts that the people that you're interviewing might just simply bring up unexpectedly. And often these will give you information which you had no idea about and lead you to further focus ideas for your research. The unstructured question is like an open-ended conversation, but if you use this type of interview, you may wander off the topic completely. This is the main danger with it, and you end up not getting the kind of information which is really useful for your research. So you have to think quite carefully about which kind of interview you're going to use. Narratives are another very helpful way of getting information in non-observational settings. And narratives really mean asking people to write life histories or autobiographies or information about themselves as teachers or learners. Sometimes we can get very useful information by finding out about factors outside the educational context that are really influencing the way in which people are learning. Just to give you a recent example of a narrative, I recently worked with some teachers who were asked to talk about critical incidents in their teaching careers. And this gave rise to a lot of very, very interesting information about the kinds of things that had motivated them and inspired them in their own teaching careers. Let's turn to another way in which you can collect data by doubling up with a classroom activity. Discussions with groups of students or with the whole class can often be an interesting way of focusing on the topic that you're interested in. And some of the teachers I've worked with have used a classroom discussion to ask students about ideas or their views, their concepts related to the particular area that they want to focus on. Focus groups are also another way of collecting data, and the focus group is a variation on the discussion or the interview, where you bring together groups of people and interview them or talk to them through conversational interaction about various ideas, various topics that you would like to have more information about. And this has been used very successfully and usefully by teachers who have done action research too. I mentioned earlier that there were ethical issues to be considered, and so let's talk a little bit more about the kinds of things that or questions that you may need to think about when focusing on ethical concerns. There are three questions really involved here. One is, whose permission or consent do you need? Who will be affected by the research? And who should be told about the research when it's completed? Do you have particular ethical requirements in your institution? How will you explain your research to those involved? How will you gain their consent to be involved? And how will you share the outcomes of the research with the participants? So when planning all the kinds of methods that I've just talked about to collect your data, please also think about these questions, as they will affect the way in which you will work with the people you've selected to involve in the research. When doing action research, another thing to consider is the validity of the research. Now, validity is not a term that's used so much in action research, and validity is certainly different from the concept that you might be familiar with through experimental research. We're more likely in action research to talk about the trustworthiness of the research and the way that we've set it up, the worthwhileness of the research, and the credibility of the research. So let me talk a little bit about what I mean by each of these terms. Well, when we're talking about trustworthiness, we're talking about whether the description, the analyses, and the findings that you present at the end of your research are reconstructed as honestly and as authentically as you can make them, basing them on the data that you've collected and letting the data speak to the results or the outcomes from the research. We may have to dump some of our own preconceptions or biases here, because the data may in the end tell us something that we had not realized was the situation, and we may have thought about things rather differently before we conducted the research. By worthwhileness, what I mean by this is the value that's accrued from the research by the participants. Have the people who part of the research journey with you actually gained value from this research. If the aim of action research is to improve things in the classroom for our students, then we need also to be very sure that they have gained something from it, that things have been made better for them, and that their learning has been enhanced, the kind of activities they're conducting in the classroom are less boring or repetitive for them, and that something has really been gained from the research by both the teachers and by the students. And finally, in terms of credibility, we need to be sure that the arguments and the processes of the research enable someone to trust the results. We need to be able to make meaningful cases for the way in which we've done the research. We need to be able to convince the participants and the people who are going to read about or look or hear about the research that the whole thing has been worthwhile and that the results are credible. So how can we do this? Well, there are various ways that we can think about strengthening validity or trustworthiness and credibility in action research. It's all to do with research quality, and we can achieve this through various ways. One of the ways which is very much used in qualitative research generally is triangulation, and what I mean by this is using more than one source to support the data that you're collecting. In other words, we might be collecting different forms of data, or we might be using different methodologies, quantitative combined with qualitative, to look at the research questions. So triangulation is to do with getting different perspectives from more than one single perspective on the questions that you're trying to answer. The next thing is that we want to test out our ideas, our questions, our concerns about the classroom through practical action. So we can strengthen validity in action research by testing the new strategies, the new actions, and finding practical ways of making them contribute to improvements in the classroom. We also want to ensure that the research aims are compatible with educational aims and also the democratic aims of making the classroom experience more teacher-friendly, more student-centered, and more balanced in the classroom. And we also want to ensure that the research design and the data collection fits in with our aims for teaching and is compatible with the teaching objectives that we have for the class. Finally, let's have a look at how we might analyze data in action research. Well, data analysis in action research doesn't really start at the end of the research process, and previously I referred to a research cycle. You'll probably find that almost as soon as you started collecting data, you'll also start thinking and reflecting on it and seeing what is coming through as a result of the new information that you're getting. So we can say that any data analysis in action research is going to be highly dynamic, and also it's going to be recursive. In other words, it's going to spiral through the whole research process in the same way that we have a cycle of research that goes on throughout the whole project. And we want to make sure also that the data analysis that we're doing is connected back to our practical action. So how is the information that we're receiving what is it telling us about the practical action that we've put in place? How are the new activities or the new strategies that we've set up for students actually making a difference? What evidence do we have from this through the data that we've collected? We also want to ensure that the reflection and the dialogue that we have with the data are unbiased. So I mentioned before that we may have to put aside our own prejudices about what happens in our classroom to see the way in which things are really occurring and the way in which the activities are being responded to in the classroom, the actions are being taken up, and so on. We'll also want to experiment further. Action research doesn't involve a one-off trial or a one-off action process. It may involve reapplication or undertaking several actions before we're satisfied with the outcome of the research. And we may even find that the things that we began with are not the questions that we need to ask at the end. So reapplication, reorientation, and taking your research into new and dynamic directions is very much a part of action research. Don't be put off if you find that the kind of thing that you started out looking at is really not the most important issue in the classroom and you end up finding something else. We need to look carefully also at what the data are really telling us and reflecting on it as much as we possibly can, synthesizing it to look at how it contributes to new ideas for the classroom and improvements on what has gone before. So we have to be open-minded throughout the whole of the action research process and to be sure that, that we're really looking at things in a deep and reflective, self-reflective way. Well, I've more or less come to the end of my talk, and in fact what I've given you is really a very quick and brief overview of what happens in action research. But many teachers have told me that action research has made a difference in their lives, and that since doing action research they've become far more interested in reading about research, in understanding more about research, and it has sometimes set them off on a professional pathway of undertaking more research. So I hope that if you do try out action research yourself or with other colleagues, and that's a great way of doing action research, that you will find it a very motivating way of ensuring your own professional development, and that you will join me and lots of other teachers across the world who are now contributing to a burgeoning and growing interest in the whole area of action research. And thank you very much for listening to the talk.